Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week, we take our stories from our weekly newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And I'm dropping the link to our website for smieconsulting.org/subscribe, where you can subscribe to that newsletter and get it in your inbox at 9 a.m. Eastern every Monday. I'm also going to drop the link to this week's edition for those of you following along at home, so you'll be able to see all the news stories that we're referring to as we go through some of these questions today. For those that are using LinkedIn more than anything else for their international edification in terms of getting news stories and such, we do have a LinkedIn version of that newsletter available as well that I'm including in the chat. So please do check out those links to subscribe to the newsletter so that by the time Wednesday rolls around, you'll have a pretty good idea from those news stories that are covering social media, international ed stories over the last 7 days, and you'll have a good idea what 3 questions we might be asking here on the Midweek Roundup. And as we do each week, we try and look at questions that are impacting our profession, our international education profession, particularly for us in the U.S. We take a look at those the data that's out there in the wider world that helps us get a better sense of what trends might be going our way, or things that we need to be aware of as we're developing our plans to recruit in certain areas. So we cover these questions from a U.S. perspective, but with a global lens. And we also look at how other countries are dealing with issues at certain points during the year. We'll cover if there are a spate of news stories about the UK. We might take a look at what's happening there and how that might inform what we do in the United States to help improve our overall international education plans. So that's our thought for the day in terms of how we hope you can use this content that we provide here on the Roundup. We'll give you the news and our hot takes on those on Monday morning, and then we'll go in depth into 3 of those themes that we see developing in the news in our Midweek Roundup. So thanks again for making us a part of your weekly journey, whether watching live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn. We really are appreciative of you including us in your weekly international edification. So as we do each week, the first question, let's jump right in and get to the topic. And it is, what do new student surveys tell us about changing priorities? And this is an important one because every time we see surveys, we have to take everything in context and obviously find out the level of the breadth of the surveys, find out how much, if this is just a agent survey or a student survey or agent and parents survey, look at the breadth of the countries that are represented. And I'll leave that analyzing of each of these survey details to your audience, to each of you, as you can make your own informed decisions about that. But I'll present my kind of high-level thoughts on what these 2 student surveys, one of which was conducted by ISEF, the other by FPP. Now, I reference these because we are in international education. These are 2 respected voices in the field. ISEF certainly has been involved in agent certification and agent training for many years and holds their agent workshops around the world every year and successfully in many locations. In the U.S., they usually do one timed around the IRC conference in December. They also do workshops across Latin America, across Europe, and Asia as well, and the Middle East. So they certainly are experts in bringing agents and institutions together in terms of finding common ground. And what they've done in this most recent survey is it's part of their agent voice survey that was conducted earlier this summer, I should say, that looked at what some of the key drivers are in agents' minds for students looking overseas, what's making them decide to one destination or the other. The agent voice survey suggests a rather not surprising, but certainly first time it's showing up as a top factor in the agent's minds for their students and parents. And that is cost of living has now become the #1 driver in the agent's minds for their students who are looking to go overseas. So cost of study and living abroad. So what that means is not just for the U.S., not just for other Western destinations, but other markets that are coming into play. And that's one of the other features of this survey was that agents in nearly a dozen top source markets named countries including Germany, South Korea, Spain, Italy, France, and Japan as destinations on the rise to compete with the major 4 Anglophone destination markets. So we're seeing a shifting landscape, and as we've talked many times here on the Roundup and in our newsletter and through our SMIE consulting services working with individual institutions, when you have a global perspective on what's going on in the world, you know that yes, the U.S.'s share of international students has shrunk. It has shrunk from probably 1/3 to 30% in the late 90s to currently about 21% of the internationally mobile students in the world are coming to the United States. So we've lost market share. But that pie has also more than doubled in that time, from about 2.7 million in the turn of the millennium to where we are now with nearly 5 million international students studying abroad. So we see this big pie, and we see not only has it become more competitive amongst the English-speaking destination countries, it's also become a much more crowded marketplace, and where you see these other countries that this ISEF survey mentioned, Germany, which basically gives free education to even international students other than their housing, South Korea, Spain, Italy, France, and Japan. China should be on this list as well. Pre-pandemic certainly would have been, probably not so much now, but you see these other markets that have risen up and have obtained pieces of that market share that have reduced our overall numbers, overall percentage, but our overall numbers have continued to grow with the pandemic exceptions, which I think we'll see a rebounding in this fall's IIE snapshot survey from fall 2022, and certainly the 21 results would show probably an increase, modest increase from the previous year's international enrollment declines that we saw for 2019 and 2020. So let's take a look with beyond this ISEF survey, agent voice survey. You see after cost of living, cost of study, cost of living as the #1 driver now for international students and their parents. The other factor, next 2 most significant factors are what we've talked about as becoming more important over recent years, and that's the post-study work and opportunities for immigration in certain countries, 66%. 75% cost of living and study, 66% work and immigration opportunities in the destination country, and then next up 61% availability of visa processing, because we know how significant visa processing issues have become in the last few months with Canada, UK seeing huge backlogs, and in certain countries that the US is doing very well in, you're seeing backlogs as well in India and across West Africa. So we see some challenges here, and we certainly see that there's other data in this survey that ISEF provides. The second one that I want to talk to you about, which gives you more of a direct feel for the students. Obviously, the ISEF one is agents' impressions of what their students and parents are feeling about. This next survey from FVP are those that are using FVP's platform, the student world, to connect with universities around the world and different markets, Canada, US, other markets around the world, UK. Those are 3 areas that they're primarily servicing, and Australia as well. But these respondents are students actively on their platform, actively looking for university places right now. And some of the insights might not seem surprising. One of them is probably will stick out. And the first question is, do you prefer to meet a university admissions director online or in person? 67% of the students that responded to this suggested they want to meet that person, admissions director, online. In person, about a third, a little less than a third. So there's still, for those that are using the FPP platform, obviously they are already self-selecting into a virtual environment, so they're probably more comfortable with that. But still, a third would want to see that person in that representative, admissions representative, in person. And in terms of who they want to see, who they want to speak with before they commit to study abroad, admissions reps are up there, right up there at 45%. Next up, current students, the next single largest group. Then professors, and professors and current students are about the same, and then local agents. So those are the four main categories of who these students want to speak with before committing to going abroad. So interesting data from that survey are those particular questions. We're talking about the registrants for this the student world. That's the FPP virtual platform, student-facing platform. That these students were invited basically from everybody through the first half of 2022 were asked to participate. They're coming from 172 countries and territories, too many to list individually. They are they're right in the target range for college age demographics. The greater majority are within that under 18 to 24-year-old demographic, with only, I think, 25% above 24 years old, so older potential graduate student markets. Now, Africa did provide the largest source of students for this FPP survey data, with nearly almost 2,700 respondents. So that were coming through the fair, but it does have a good cross-section across the globe after Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Pakistan, Cameroon, Philippines, Brazil, Kenya, Bangladesh, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Ethiopia, Morocco, Colombia, Rwanda, South Africa, India, Afghanistan, Turkey, Mexico, Sri Lanka, Liberia, Peru, and Tunisia. So an interesting mix of Latin America, Middle East, and Asia. So in terms of some of the other key questions that were asked, I think knowing that they want to speak with admissions directors, what does that mean? Knowing that they want to also get in touch with students and professors as part of their journey. I think that's highlighting some areas that perhaps maybe the current students you're involving or alumni you're involving in your international admissions, but how are you engaging with professors at your institution in your recruitment process? Are you doing specific things maybe through virtual open houses or maybe admitted student events later in the cycle where you would have opportunities for students from those who are interested in those disciplines, have opportunities to chat with professors from the field. So those certainly stick out as areas that we want to look at. But the question about where students are accessing information on study abroad opportunities is important, I think. And we've seen changes in this over the years. It used to be college search engines were by far and away the #1 search with 40–50% of all respondents. We're now seeing that social media has become clear in a way, probably with close to 40%, search engines down near 25 to 30%. So we're seeing clear predilections to using social media as part of their college search. Now that should be an interesting point of reference for you, because obviously you have social media activities that are you're hoping to drive interest in your institution, that you're hoping, whether they're ads, whether they're posts on across social media, but you want to know how your institution is being talked about as well, and having that component of social listening in what you do needs to be a piece of that puzzle. So so that you know how you're being referenced in the marketplace, but also how and where you can respond. And knowing which platforms, again, is an important piece of that. But we're seeing a clear move toward these, obviously digital still has sway over most everybody's decision-making process in terms of the greatest majority of sources used are going to be digital of some way, shape, or form. But those search engines are still a valid part of that process, but social media has become increasingly so. We even saw this a few weeks back. We saw a post that showed that TikTok is being used by students as a search engine. And that's frightening because if your institution isn't on TikTok, maybe that would be even more frightening in that you don't know necessarily how to explore that space. But certainly one that I would recommend paying attention to is if you're going to have a presence on social, is make sure you're listening to how your institution's being talked about, because that's where students are going to find out information about you now, whether you like it or not. So that's their search engine now, and not necessarily just a college search site like a Hot Courses or study portals or one of these many other lead gen platforms that are out there. So definitely recommend digging into this data from FVP a little bit more in terms of what platforms that are using most to get information on study abroad. That was the next level down. And you see Facebook at 38%, Instagram at 33%, YouTube at 13%, Twitter 1.9, TikTok 2.2, and other 10.9. So it might be the WeChat versions or other platforms that are out there. So Facebook still, and Instagram too. Those two are the primary drivers, with nearly over 2/3 of students that are using social media to get information about study abroad are doing so through Facebook and Instagram. We think Facebook's dead in the United States. That might be the case. It may be less impactful for students in the United States, but abroad it still matters in many markets. So that's something to keep in mind as you make your way through. So let's move on to our second question of the day, and that happens to be, who is winning the battle for African students? Now, Africa is a market that is a very complex one. It's one that often gets a very bad rap in terms of the chances of getting students out, that they all need full aid, or that there's a lot of fraud in the market. The funding isn't there, or if they are, they're using irreputable or disreputable agents to get there. So there's a lot of chatter out there, negative chatter about recruiting students in Africa, but the reality is they are the fastest growing. It's the fastest growing continent and region of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, with the largest youth population on the planet, and a rising middle class in many of these key markets. Now, the data that we're sharing first is a University World News article by Xiaofeng Wang, who's at Amherst College in Massachusetts and has been writing quite a bit in the last 3 years, particularly during the pandemic, about how Amherst has been working with parents and students and school networks in China, and has produced some really good articles over the years for that. But now Xiaofeng is talking about the impact of China in Africa, and that's one that kind of sticks out a little bit in terms of, well, who's if you haven't been paying attention in the last few years, China has done quite a bit to expand their global footprint through their Belt and Road initiatives, and this is a multi-layered, multi-level plan that Chinese Communist Party rolled out in the late noughties to expand its soft power influence in the world, Belt and Road initiative. And they've done that through infrastructure projects, through loans, through all sorts of building projects in South and East Asia, through all of Africa, and even into Europe. So these have been ways for China to gain influence with governments in those countries. They have educational partnerships that they form. They have scholarship programs that are very generous for African students to come and study in China. So one of the facts from this from the Xiaofeng's article is that in terms of raw numbers going out of sub-Saharan Africa abroad, that China actually is the second largest recipient of sub-Saharan African students after France. So the U.S. is actually in, I think, third, and then the U.K. is in fourth, or it might be switched. But France, China, the U.S. and U.K. are the next leading countries in recruiting African students. So there's a lot of challenges, as we know. We've seen issues with funding. I've worked at institutions back in the mid-90s that had actually because of problems with previous students coming from certain African countries, that they would come, get to campus, and suddenly plead poverty after showing bank statements that they had more than enough to cover 2 years of full education. That problem caused us at this institution to require a full semester's tuition deposit in order to ensure that we were getting students who could pay their bills to come to actually enroll in our campus. That also helped with the visas at that time. But now visa denial rates are in excess of 50% in most West African and sub-Saharan countries. So that has posed some challenges for institutions that have been trying to recruit heavily in this region, or getting a lot of applications, but maybe not a lot of completed ones, and those that complete and go for visa appointments, getting a far fewer of those than they might have originally thought, or given the amount of time and effort that they have invested in those countries, in recruiting in those countries. Maybe it's a lot, maybe it's not much. But what I can say is, up until the pandemic, there have been undergraduate recruitment tours, primarily led by CIS, the Council for Europe, Middle East, or the Committee for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which I used to serve on back in the day, did regular yearly recruitment trips to Africa, going back to as late as the late 90s or early 2000s. Those stopped during the pandemic, so there hasn't been a regular tour to sub-Saharan Africa to recruit students, particularly at the undergraduate level. So it's been the one-offs, it's been the small groups that have been going lately. Meanwhile, China has come in with significant aid, and that aid has made a difference in terms of bringing students from Africa to China in this case. U.S. institutions have know and realize this if they've recruited there for a while, and probably have seen more success recruiting African graduate students than undergraduate students because of the aid that they might be able to get in terms of assistantships and other scholarships. For the undergraduate students to come from Africa to the U.S., they need to have substantial, there may be the few families every year that can afford most, if not all, of the full cost of education at your institutions, but they're few and far between. They're a growing number, but for the majority of Africans that are applying to your institutions, they are still going to need some aid. And how much you're able to get, particularly for undergraduates, unless you're a D1 school and have athletic scholarships to kind of pick and choose some of the best candidates, it might be a tougher sell. So it's a matter of prioritizing your institutional resources, and if diversification is on your radar as a point of a strategic plan for an international recruitment, diversification should include Africa, and that might mean you need to have scholarships specifically for students from that region that can at least get your foot in the door in some of these countries to potentially build a pipeline. After you get one, they tell two friends, and back home, and they tell two friends, and so on and so on. And then you have a shampoo commercial with thousands of Hollywood squares lit up with new students coming from those countries. So that's an old reference, and I'm dating myself from the 70s and 80s here in terms of my commercial memories from back in the day. But this article from Xiaofeng certainly gives a nice perspective on China's role in recruiting in Africa, bringing students, and how well or not well U.S. is positioned. And some quotes in there from Diane Weiss-Young from Education USA, REACT for West and Central Africa. So definitely recommend reading that article. Next on this list, in terms of Africa, is Ghana. Ghana shows that it's been one of the steadily growing outbound markets for Western nations to recruit. Canada, UK, Germany, and the US are certainly some of the key destinations for Ghanaian students. It has a large youth population, stable democracy, according to this ISIF article that I posted the link to, and has English language proficiency, make it a very favorable and attractive source market. So though the overall numbers are still relatively small, the good news is overall they have doubled from 2010, nearly doubled from 2010 to 2020. So from about 9,300 to 18,200 over the last decade. So the good news is the numbers have steadily been rising. So there's trends, and that's not just all the U.S. Actually, the U.S. has for U.S. educators, after Nigeria, Ghana is the second largest market, and there were in Open Doors data last year there were over 4,200 Ghanaians in the U.S. So for the UK, they have, I think, 2,600 in 2020. So US is the number one market. Canada's at about 1,200 right now in 2021. So you see US, UK, Canada, and then Germany as some of the top. And we don't have the numbers, comparable numbers for China from Ghana. But consider that to be in a market that you'll certainly want to keep your eyes on. That 57% of the population is under the age of 25 in Ghana, talking about that factors we just said with the larger Africa piece. These are the countries now that certainly U.S. Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs within State Department is highlighting Ghana among some of the key top 10 or 11 countries that U.S. institutions should be paying attention to in terms of recruitment opportunities. So definitely keep your eye on Ghana. And probably a market that will continue to grow, and I would certainly see that will be something that most institutions will be looking to prioritize. One of the institutions I've been consulting with recently, they have a president who has ties to Ghana. From Ghana, they've established a articulation agreement with Cape Coast College. And they are now getting a study pipeline, or hoping to get a study pipeline from that as a result. So that you be creative with how you go after certain markets. That you might need to be partnership driven as opposed to individual one student by one student by one student. So it will you'll find ways to get into all these different markets if you're smart. Now, as we transition to this next question, and this is the last one for the day, where are student markets we cannot ignore? I would include Ghana and Nigeria in that mix, probably Kenya as well, as growing markets that you have to invest in. It's not going to be something you want to get left behind on as those markets continue to expand. What I would say is that Ghana, include that in this next question here of where some of these student markets are that we can't ignore. The two that are going to pop up most are India and Indonesia, and we'll be dropping the links to those here in the chat as well. And the Indian numbers, this article from Pi News this past week on India, and the second one on Indonesia and their outbound and TNE potential is quite remarkable. What you see from India is a recent survey that showed over 57% of India's middle class families are inclined to spend on overseas education, according to new research. Now, they're defining middle class in India as those between incomes between 3,700 to 12,000. I don't know if that's annual, just says an income of between 3,700 to 12,000. So I'm guessing that might be annual, and if it is, that not all of that obviously is going to be 12,000 a year. Hopefully maybe that's a month. I don't know. It doesn't say. But what it does suggest that I don't know what that size of the middle class in India would be, but certainly with 1.3 billion population, even if a middle class is only 20%, that is still over 100 million 100 million families. Well, 100 million families might mean 50 million students, perhaps, in the mix. I don't know those exact numbers, and I don't want to claim to know what that looks like. But just even on conservative numbers, that would show that that's a huge potential there. Now, caution here is that not all of these are going to be able to afford a full boat at a U.S. institution or any major Western destination, but they are, like many other countries, like the data we saw from the agent survey at the top, is they're open to other markets. They're looking at New Zealand, France, Ireland, Italy as other destinations that they're maybe considering. So they are, by 2025, here's one of the mouth-watering stats that they include from the survey. Indian students are expected to see over 2 million Indian students fly out by 2025. That will mean over $100 billion spending over $100 billion on their international education. Wow. And that's just India. In the next 3 years, we'll have 2 million students studying abroad. and that will be rivaling, probably surpassing China at that point in terms of the amount that are going abroad and the amount that they're spending on international education. So you've probably already seen it. There isn't another India or China out there, but India is a market that you've been seeing growth in the grad market again, which is comforting. But you may also be seeing, and which I think is going to be a much larger phenomenon in the years to come, is the growth of the Indian undergraduate market. And I'll actually be presenting about this at the ARC conference in December with Manisha Zaveri and Derek Alex. Manisha from Career Mosaic in India, one of the larger agencies there, and Derek Alex from University of Houston. So shout out to both of them. I'm looking forward to presenting with you on this important topic about India and the rise of Indian undergraduates. But another market that the PIE News covers in depth is, through its article, is Indonesia. Potential is huge there. Again, factors that we've talked about in the past about young population, rising middle class, increasing higher education enrollment rates. There's huge promise there. Indonesia has been targeted by the UK as one of the top 5 priority countries for the British government for universities in the UK. You see the idea of improving their own higher education system and wanting to have international universities set up in country. So the doors are open to that in ways that support Indonesia's development of benefits local institutions. But it's also a way that there's going to be more outbound students going through a government scholarship program as well. So don't sleep on Indonesia either. So there's a lot to go over, and we're running out of time here today. But I do want to say a special shout out to those who are continuing to download our podcast each week as part of their listening. If you like the audio-only version of this rather than the recorded sessions on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Certainly happy to have you part of the International Ed family here at SMIE Consulting, and looking forward to chatting with you more in the weeks to come. So until next time, have a wonderful day.